Hello students, myself is Karuna Gupta. Welcome to my channel. Well, CBSE has announced for practical exams and I know all of you are very anxious. You want to perform your best for the practical exam? Well, through this video, I have come up with the do's and don'ts for your day of exam, and also I have tried to jot down a few important questions that will help you through the Viva part. As we all know that practical exams are very important. As per CBSE norms, you have to pass out the both theory as well as practical exams individually. So here are some key points for your day of exam. The first and foremost, you need to prepare well beforehand. Secondly, you should know each and every concept of your practical and project files. Please go through that very detailed manner. The third important point, be confident. At the same time, stay calm. Make eye contact with your examiner, listen carefully, and don't rush to answer. Answer it in a very composed manner. At the same time, keep in mind you do not have to argue with the examiner. Next, be in proper school uniform and in a presentable manner. Your hair should be neatly done. You do not have to look shabby. Last but not the least, students, do not sit quiet. Do not act dumb. Even if you do not know the exact answer, try to speak whatever you know best about the question being asked. So now students, let us talk about some of the frequently asked questions from your project file. Well, generally, the first and foremost question from your examiner is going to be, tell me something about your project. To this, the answer has to be user specific. You should begin with the title of your project. Then you talk about the technology that you have used, like Python as the programming language, maybe CSV for data storage or MySQL connector. You talk about the different modules you have created, the different functions, how your program is organized into. You talk about the reports that you have generated from this data. Also, you can talk about the future scope of the project, how this project can be modified. Alright. Next, the examiner can ask you whether you have done by the project yourself. Yes, very confidently you have to answer. You may talk about some of the references that you have taken help with your teacher or maybe some elder brother or sister, but it has to be yes. Next, examiner may ask you what is the front end, what is back end. Now these terms you must understand. A front end is the user interface through which the end user, the non-technical user, is going to interact with your application. This is your programming language like Python. For backend, it has to be the data storage application like MySQL or CSV files. The examiner may also ask you about what are your CSV files, how many files you have created. Now for this, your question again has to be user specific. The name of your files should be the tips of your fingers. You cannot fumble out over here. If the examiner asks you about what do you understand by CSV files, you can explain that CSV stands for common separated values. It is a plain text format with a series of values, a combination of values which are separated by a delimiter, which is generally a comma. Now you can also use some other character as this delimiter. Okay. So these files are generally very lightweight. They are very useful for data transportation across different applications. That is why they are so popular. You can store the CSV files in spreadsheet like Excel or Notepad. If the examiner asks you about data structures, to this you can say that yes, data structures are a means of organizing and storing data in computers. Now, about the commonly used data structures in Python, we have series and data frames in your syllabus, so you can very conveniently name these two. If the examiner asks you about each of these topics, what do you understand by series? You can say a series is a one-dimensional labeled data structure which can hold data such as strings, integer, or maybe any other Python object. But please remember one thing, a series is size immutable. That means you cannot change the size dynamically. Now that your project is mainly centered around the data frame object, the examiner can ask you to explain the data frame object. So this you should say that a data frame is a two-dimensional size mutable object. It is also heterogeneous in nature. That means you can hold a variety of databases, integer, string or any other data type in one single data frame. It is a tabular structure with labeled axes, both row and columns, they are labeled, right? You could also be asked about how to access the elements, how you can reach out to the values, individual values in your data frame. So for this you should answer that by using the unique index values, you can access the values or the elements of your data frame. The examiner can also ask you about the syntax to read and write from a data frame. So for this, you must understand all the parameters of your read CSV function, which is there to read from a CSV file into a data frame. The first parameter, it is your file name. Students, you should understand that the CSV file, if it is residing in your local folder, where your Python file .py file for program is residing, in that case you may give only the file name like res data in my example over here. But if it is in some different folder, you should give the complete path. Please take a note of this. The second parameter is the separator, which generally is comma, but you may also give some other character that you like. The third parameter, header, it specifies the number of rows whose values are to be used as the column names. Or you can say it also marks the start of data to be fetched. These are the two main important functions. One is the read CSV, other is writing back to CSV, from data frame back to CSV. See, your approach has to be the CSV files, the Excel files, they store their data permanently, right? So for processing the data, I bring this data from CSV into my data frame. I do the processing whether I want to add new records, whether I want to edit some data, or I want to manipulate that data in different ways to form my reports, right? But after the processing, I also need to write back that data from my data frame into the CSV. The function for this, to_CSV. Again, please remember the complete syntax. The first parameter is your file name, either complete file path or only the file name if it is the same folder. The second parameter, again the separator. The third is the header. Or you can also talk about the fourth parameter, which is the index parameter. By specifying that index equal to false, you want to say that you do not want the row labels to be written to the file on the disk. So the examiner by now has had some idea about your project. He or she will be flipping through your file and may ask you some questions about the functionality that you have used. You could be asked about the definition of a function. The examiner might ask you, define a function. What do you mean by a function? For that, you should answer that these functions are named group of instructions. So there are the group of instructions and you are giving all these instructions with a particular name, and that name is the function name, right? So how are these functions helpful? They provide reusability of code and they also provide modularity to a program. One complex task is being divided into smaller, logical, understandable tasks. That is modularity. You could be asked about the syntax for defining a function. You should be able to elaborate it on a piece of paper. Then, what are the various modules in a Python? A module should be defined as an object with arbitrarily named attributes that you can bind or reference. Or simply you can say that a module is a file consisting of Python code which may have functions, classes and certain variables. What all modules you have used? So you can tell all the modules that you have used during your curriculum in classes 11th and 12th. That is random module, pickle, CSV, MySQL.connector, MySQL DB, matplot, Whatever you have used in whatever extent that you can explain. The examiner might also ask you what are packages, so you can explain that a package is a collection of related modules in directories that give a package hierarchy. How can you use an existing module? A very important question. Simple answer, by using the import statement. At the top of your program, you write import followed by the name of module. Now let us come to the MySQL. Students, MySQL is a very important part of your curriculum. So the examiner definitely is going to ask you some questions from MySQL as well. Let us begin. The first question could be the difference between SQL and MySQL. Students, you need to understand that MySQL is a product. It is an open source relational database management system, or you can say RDBMS, that uses SQL as a query language. Now SQL is a common product, is a common component that works with many different DBMS applications. Like SQL is there with Oracle as well. SQL is there with MS Access or Microsoft SQL Server. There are different database applications. Okay, so there are small syntax changes there might be there from one RDBMS to another RDBMS. But essentially, logically, it's more or less the same, right? So you can say MySQL is a open DBMS application, whereas SQL is a standard query language that is one of the components with RDBMS. The examiner might also ask you to name a few DBMS applications. So here are a few examples that I have given. You might also be asked about the difference between DDL and DML commands. This is one of a very favorite, very frequently repeated questions. So you must recollect DDL, or the data definition language. It is used to create the database objects or maybe change the structure or drop the database objects. The commands can be create table, alter table, drop table. There can also be various other commands, but these are the ones in your curriculum. Then DML, it stands for data manipulation language. Manipulation means through which you are changing the data inside the tables or the objects. So there can be commands like insert, update and delete. So DML is basically used either to add the data, update the data, delete the data, or maybe to retrieve using the select command. Next, the examiner can ask you about group by command. This is a very important concept in your syllabus. So you must understand that group by is used to arrange identical data values within a column. So the records on the basis of value, they are divided into various groups, and then you might be performing various aggregate functions on those group of records, right? So the children, see, one thing you must realize, one thing leads to another. So similarly, the examiner might ask you new questions from your own answers as well. Like when you are explaining group by, so it's quite possible the examiner asks you to write a command on the basis of any given data, maybe from your question paper only. Okay, or the examiner writes a command and he asks you, "ठीक है बेटा, now tell me what will be the output." The group by command is generally used with aggregate functions like count, min, max, sum, average. You could also be asked about the difference between where and having clause. So now we need to recollect that where clause, it works at the record level. That means when we have to select the records, which one to display in the output and which should not be, we use conditions with where clause. So the records that qualify that condition, they are displayed in the output. Alright. The having clause is also there with certain condition, but having clause works with groups. Now that you have created groups with the group by command, after that only the having can be applied. Please remember, the having clause cannot work without group. Next, the examiner can also ask you difference between group by and order by. So now you have to answer that group by is used to generate summarized data on the basis of a column or the values in a column, right? So as many different values are there, as many groups are created. Order by, on the other hand, is used to rearrange the data in either ascending or descending order. Another question can be about null values. So you can say null value simply means no value, absence of value. It's neither 0 if in a numeric column, or maybe it's not even a blank string if the column is char, var, char or date. Right? Now the examiner might also ask you what is the difference between 0 and null. So you must carefully answer that 0 will lead to a calculation. 0 can be used in mathematical calculations. Like if you are adding any number with 0, the result will be the number itself. Whereas if you are adding null value with any number, the answer would be null. Right? So please be careful. Students, see, you all have studied throughout the year. The only thing is, keep calm. Try to recollect whatever you have studied and answer accordingly. Do not panic, that is the key. You could also be asked about what are the functions in MySQL. Now you should answer that function is used to perform a particular task and it returns either 0 or more values as a result. So it is performing a specific task. There are functions based on different categories of data. We shall be discussing that. The categories of data, major categories are scalar and aggregate functions. You could be asked to explain the difference. So you can say the scalar functions, or you can also say these are single row functions. They are applied on a single row or a data value. For example, you can give left function, right function, lcase, round, year, POW. All of these are scalar functions. Alright, they work with one value each time. The aggregate functions, on the other hand, they work with multiple rows or records and they are generating one output like sum, min, max, count, AVG, etc. Another very important question, count and count star, difference between the two. So now you must remember that count star, it returns the total number of records in a table irrespective of the null or not null values, right? On the other hand, if you are using count function with a particular column name, this will return you only the not null values, the number of not null values for that particular column. Basically, count column name is the count of values and count star is the count of records. Okay? Coming to the various categories of scalar function, there are three main categories depending on the three data types, that is numeric, string and date time functions. The examiner can also ask you any of the functions from these categories, like the power function. This is going to calculate x raised to the power y. That means the first number raised to the power second number. For example, if I say power of 2, 3, this is going to be 2 raised to the power 3. The answer would be 8. Students, if you are asked a question about MySQL functions, I would suggest always explain with an example. Like the examiner might ask you about the round function. He can give you some number and ask you what would be the output. So now you have to remember the working of round function. The basic working is that it has to round off the number, whatever is given as the first parameter n. So this is the number on which rounding has to take place, the first parameter. Okay, so this is the number to be rounded. Whereas after comma, the second parameter d, it applies how many digits the number has to be rounded off. For example, if I say round off 2912.564 to be rounded to one decimal place, that means after the decimal point I have to retain only one digit. So I have to truncate this 64. Alright, when I am truncating this, please take care of the first digit. This is of the most significant value. If this digit is 5 or more, it adds 1 to the previous. That means the answer will be 2912.6. If the number is 283.2, no digit specified. That means it has to be reduced to a whole number. There should be no decimal point after this. So if I'm going to truncate this decimal point, the digit is 2. which is less than 5, that means there is no effect and the number remains 283. Had it been 283.7, the answer would have been 284 because 0.7 greater than 5. I hope it is clear now. Mod function. Mod function is going to give you the remainder after dividing the first parameter with the second parameter. Whatever is the remainder, that is the answer. For example, if I say mod of 23, 5, 23 is to be divided by 5. 5 4s are 20. The remainder comes out to be 3. Yes, good. Next, the examiner can ask you to give some examples of string functions. You can say the upper function, ucase, lower, lcase, mid, substring, instr, length function, left, right, ltrim, rtrim. There are so many functions you could explain. You could also be asked to give some example from the date time category. So there are cur date, now, date, month, month name, year, day, day name. Students, I advise please go through this topic from your textbook very carefully, the working of each and every function. I cannot take up each and every function in this video because this is going to make it very long and it is very aptly elaborated in your textbook. Please go through that very carefully. I'm only taking few very often asked questions that have been repeated, like difference between delete and drop. Now delete command is used to delete the records. The table remains as it is. Alright. But the drop command will remove the table from the memory. It is permanently gone. The structure is also gone. Another advice, students, also revise the syllabus from your class 11. Like these commands, delete, drop, alter, update. They are not a part of your class 12 curriculum. But still, these are very common things that you must know. You might be asked, you should be having this experience now from your term 1 exams. Questions from NumPy were also asked. That was a curriculum in class 11. So please revise the entire syllabus. 11th and 12th, they are related. Alright. The difference between alter and update. Alter table is a DDL command. It is used to change the structure. Either you want to add a column or maybe you want to drop a column. Maybe you want to change the data type or rename a column. For all these, maybe you want to add a primary key later after creating the table. So all these changes are possible with the alter table command. Whereas update is used to change the data values inside the table. You have created the table, you have inserted the records. Now you want to change some of the values that might have gone wrong. For that, update command is there. How to add a record and a column. Adding a record, you have insert command. Adding a column, you have the alter table command. And just now in the previous question, I told you this. Talking about the constraints. Well, constraints are some data validation rules, you can say, that will not allow the incorrect data to be entered inside your table. So these, you can say, they act as gatekeepers. They do not want invalid data in your table. Apply constraints. What are the different examples of constraints? Like primary key, foreign key, unique constraint, not null constraint, right? So these are various. Default is also one of the constraints. You could be asked questions on each one of them. Remember the definitions for primary key, foreign key, candidate key, alternate key. They are all given very clearly in your textbooks. Learn them. You could also be asked a question, what is the difference between unique and primary key? So please remember, primary key, there can be only one primary key in a table. Whereas you might have more than one unique constraints applied to different columns in a table. Also, primary key will not allow even a single null value. Whereas unique constraint will allow only one null value. After that, second null value, it is not unique, not allowed. Now there are some simpler questions. There might be some general questions that are asked in Python, like what is IDLE? So this you can explain that IDLE is an integrated development learning environment. It can be used to execute a single command just like shell, or also to create the Python scripts. The examiner might also ask you two modes of working. You should answer interactive and script mode. That's very simple. You have done this in class 11. Various assignment statements, like there are multiple assignments used in this particular statement, A, C, D, D. So the values are assigned in corresponding manner. A is given the value 1, B is given the value 2, C as the value 3, or maybe D as the value 4. You can also assign a common value to multiple variables, like if I write A equal to B equal to 0. This means both the variables A and B, they are assigned the same value, that is 0. You might be asked about the data types in Python. What are the primitive data types? So the primitive data types in Python: numbers, strings, list, tuple, dictionary. You could be asked about the single quoted, double quoted and triple quoted strings as well. For this you can answer that a double quoted string can have a single quote or an apostrophe as one of the characters inside that. Like if I want to give something like Rohan's with an apostrophe, I need to enclose it in a double quotes, or otherwise I can escape it with a backslash character. Remember, you have some special characters that can be denoted with a backslash, like backslash n, that stands for a new line, or maybe a backslash t, that stands for a tab character. For triple quoted strings, you can say that they are used generally for multi-line strings. You could be asked questions about various operators, generally what are confusing to the students, so they are frequently asked: the divide, integer division and the modulus operator. You could explain that with the help of examples as well. The examiner might also ask you questions on string, tuple, dictionaries and string list. For this, I strongly recommend you go through the first chapter, that is review of Python basics, whatever you have done in class 11. So these are simple concepts. You have done that all during the class 11th and 12th. It is not at all difficult. You can score a perfect 30 on 30. I'm saying that again. The only thing, stay calm, stay positive, try to recollect and try to study hard before that. Prepare well in advance. That is the key. So very obviously, if you are prepared, you'll not feel that nervousness. To score a complete 30 on 30. The examiners can also ask you about your project or maybe about the practical file, whether you've done it yourself. Very obviously, you have to reply in a confident yes. But that also means that you also need to explain. It cannot go unexplained and just saying yes, then very obviously the examiner makes out. Alright, then the examiner, by seeing your practical file, can ask you about the various sequence constructs. At this point, you can tell the examiner that these are the set of statements or the type of programs which are executed in a serial manner. That is, one command after the other in exactly the same way as they are written. The execution is similar. If the examiner is asking you about the selection construct, you need to explain that there are selection constructs possible in Python with the help of if, elif and else statements. Very obviously, these constructs are based on the test conditions. So if the test is true, the if part is executed. If the test evaluates to false, the else part is executed. You could also be asked to explain iteration or what is looping. So there you have to tell that it is a repetition of a set of statements until a particular condition remains true. So as soon as the condition becomes false, you exit out of the loop. You could be asked about infinite loop. So that you have to tell that it is a never-ending loop that keeps on executing because the test condition will always evaluate to true. You also need to be careful about the loop control elements, like where you are initializing the variables, whatever is the test condition, the loop body or the set of statements which are being repeated, and the update expression. How is for loop different from while loop? This is a very frequently asked question. For this you have to answer that for loop is used in situation where number of iterations are fixed. You know that in advance. Whereas the while loop can be used in variable number of iterations. Another important question that is explicit to Python, the else statements with Python loops. You need to be very clear, like if statement has a else, loops also have a else part. But the loop else part is only executed when your loop is not terminated by a break. That means it terminates its natural course of action. Only then the loop else part is executed. So that is it, student, for now. Although there could be more questions from the conversation that you strike with your examiner. So keep preparing. Nothing can stop you. All the very best.